So we had a look at ref for single values and reactive for objects if we want to group values together and want to ensure that we can edit properties just like this and still maintain reactivity. Now, enough about ref and reactive. We're going to see more of that as we write more code with the composition API. But now let's actually come back to this simple slide here. We learned that the data that's managed with the data option can be replaced with ref and reactive. Now we also have methods computed and watch, which I mentioned would be replaced. So let's now move on to methods here. For that, let's say we have a button here on this page, and it will be a simple button with no particular styling. And there I'll say change age. And when we click it, I want to change my age here. So for that, of course, we can add a click listener. And now normally with the options API, we would point at a method here. We would add our methods option to this config object and then have something like set new age or any name like this. And if we then had a age data property here, like 31 initially, we would set this age equal to 32, for example. That is how we would do it with the options API, with data and methods combined. Now, we're using the composition API, and therefore we don't have data, and we won't have methods. But how can we then call a function, call some code to be executed when an event occurs? How do we bind click here? Well, of course, we could access user age and set a new value here. You might remember that simple JavaScript expressions like this are allowed, and therefore we could do that. So if I keep this code and actually remove this timer, because I no longer want to update name and age with that, so let's remove the timer. So if I save that now, we have that button and it works. But running all the code that should run upon button clicks and form submissions in the template like this is definitely not what we want to do. It's a good practice to not put too much logic into the template, and if you consider more complex examples like form submissions where you also want to validate user input and maybe show alerts and so on, then this absolutely would not be an option. Instead, the solution is actually very simple, though it might look strange when you see it the first time. The setup method here is called when Vue sets up this component. It's called only once. And in this setup method, you basically define the data which should be available in your template. Well, you cannot just define your data here, you can also define the functions that should be available to your template. We can add a function here, set new data could be the name, and we can expose that to the template as well. It might look strange that we define a function inside of a method, but this is regular JavaScript code. We can create functions inside of functions. This is absolutely fine. And actually, with set timeout before, we did nothing different. There, we also had a function which we created on the fly here. That's also just a function defined inside of the setup method. So defining a function here is fine. And in this function, we could set user age equal to 32. And now the question is, how do we expose this function to the template so that we can bind it to this click event? Well, just as we expose data, we can add a new key value pair to this object which we return here in the setup method, and for example have a set age key and point at set new data or set new age maybe, and change the name up here as well. And I'm not executing the function here, I'm just pointing at it. So I'm storing a pointer at this function in the setAge property in this returned object. And this returned object simply holds all the things you can use in your template. That may be data like our user object, but it may also be a pointer at a function. So now setAge is the key here, So therefore, we can bind our click event here to set age. And this will then trigger the setNewAge function at which we point in setAge. And therefore, if I save that and reload, we can still change the age, but now with this exposed function. And that's really simple, but this is how you expose functions which you typically bind to click events, but which you also can execute just like that between interpolation, for example. That's how you expose them to your template. You define them in setup and return them in your object. And that's your replacement for methods in the end. Simple as that. And of course, it does not just work with a reactive object, but instead, if we would go back to using refs, so if I reverse this all and I go back to uname and uage and having two refs instead of one object, then of course, we can also update our data here with uage value equal to 33, for example. Now we just need to change the code we exposed to the template because I went back to using two individual values. So now we could again expose, let's say, a username and an age like that. Exposing these two refs, which are defined here, where one of them is changed here, through the value property, which is watched by view as you learned. And then in the template, we can use username and age to output both. So username and age here. And with that in place, if we save this, this still works, and updating also still works. So that's how we can replace methods. Of course, you can define and return as many functions as your component might need in the template.